Election 92 is here. To talk about its progress, we have two DePauw professors in the political science department, Professor Calvert and Professor Nasr. Issue 1, Pat Buchanan. With George Bush receiving over 90% of the electoral vote, there came a man, Pat Buchanan. With the exception of Tennessee and Mississippi, he has consistently been able to receive 1/3 of the vote. Professor Calvert, is he durable? Will he last?
Well, that's hard to say. He's being put under an awful lot of pressure now by the Republican Party establishment to drop out. And the question is, why is he running at all? You have to ask that question before you can find out how long he's going to stay in. If he's running in an authentic bid for the presidency as a loyal Republican, then it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for him to withstand the pressure to drop out. If, on the other hand, he has other motives, perhaps his own presidential ambitions in 1992, or simply to make an ultra-conservative statement against George Bush, then he might want to stay in a lot longer. So we have to try to figure out why he's running before we can figure out how long he's likely to stay in. Professor Nasr.
I think one of his goals is probably, and this is implied at least in some of what Bob indicated, he wants to, I think, keep President Bush on a relatively conservative track. He wanted, I think, to steal the show from David Duke because the conservative wing in the Republican Party did not, I think, want to have a Duke as the representative or at least assumed or thought of as representing the conservative wing. And I think...
Do you think he really represents the conservative wing, Pat Buchanan, or is he representing Pat Buchanan?
Well, these labels are awfully slippery. But if you consider that George Bush represents something like the middle now of the Republican spectrum, and by the way, there's a real problem, and I'll come back to this, there's a real problem about what George Bush, if George Bush represents anything at all. That's part of the issue. But if he can be located near the center, there are an awful lot of the people in the Republican Party who are more conservative than George Bush, and I would say that that probably does not actually include Pat Buchanan. I wouldn't put him as a conservative at all. I think the accusations made against him to this effect are correct. Pat Buchanan, and even more so David Duke, represents not a real conservative strain in the party, but something like its radical fringe. Pat Buchanan, if you take the substance of his appeals, what it is he would like to do, does not really stand for any conservative element, any really conservative element in the Republican Party. He is a radical.
Professor Nasr.
I agree with this. I think he probably represents the more radical conservative side, because many conservatives came out in public in support of President Bush.
Do you think he also represents a new type of politician, a media personality, gaining popularity and running for president? If you go to a David Letterman show in New York, you'll see signs, Letterman for president or Marv for president. Now this brings it one step farther with a person such as Pat Buchanan, who's on Crossfire, a CNN show. He has garnered some support that way. Do you think we're seeing a new type of politician?
I don't agree. No, I don't think so at all. The Letterman for president is a joke. Nobody takes that seriously. No media personality, with the possible exception of Ronald Reagan, has ever been seriously active by. Shouldn't put that so emphatically, but Pat Buchanan's appeal is not because he's a media person, not because he's a journalist, but because he is saying things that a lot of Americans respond warmly to.
What are some of his issues that they're responding warmly to?
Well, let's back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
Some of the biggest claim that, one of the biggest claims that Buchanan is making that's getting him a lot of support is exactly that George Bush has, as he puts it, walked away from the Reagan program. Now, there's a lot of dispute about that. It's not clear one way or the other. I mean, there are arguments both sides about the extent to which George Bush has or has not fulfilled the Reagan program. But at least a lot of people perceive that George Bush has not done this. They perceive this because it's awfully hard to tell what George Bush really does believe in. And this is where Buchanan is hammering very effectively at him. It's often said by people who don't subscribe at all to Pat Buchanan's views, as I don't, that, look, if I were a Republican, I would be very tempted to be supportive of Pat Buchanan because at least the man does believe something, which can't be said of George Bush, or at least that's the argument that's made.
I believe that President Bush can be said to have ran into the Reagan problems, really, and therefore it is very difficult for us to try to draw parallels between the two men. But going back to an issue you raised a while ago about Buchanan, although President Reagan, for instance, was a media exploiter, so to speak, he had to have extensive political experience, rather extensive, as a governor before he could seriously contest elections for the presidency, something which Pat Buchanan lacks almost completely.
I noticed that too. If you look at the resume, Bush is incredible. CIA director, head of the UN, but the knack that was on him was that they weren't elected offices.
Well, of course.
Now, having president, he had the one of the few opportunities on that resume to put an elected office on there. But
look, nobody thinks seriously that Pat Buchanan has a chance to be president. If his most partisan and fanatical followers believe that, they're simply naive. He doesn't have a chance to be president. Nobody would, I think a lot of the people who are supporting him now would drop quickly their support if they thought there was ever a danger that Pat Buchanan would become president. On the other hand, it's not altogether clear that the votes that are going to Pat Buchanan are going to Buchanan because of him, or rather simply as a protest vote to say, I don't like George Bush, I would vote for anybody other than George Bush. Pat Buchanan happens to be there, I'll vote for Pat Buchanan.
And they even mentioned in some states they have the independents are able to vote in the on the Republican side of the ticket, so he gets some of those votes too. Yeah. What about the protest vote? Do you think that Buchanan can feel confident when he gets 30%, or do you feel that it's a majority of the protest vote and come thick or thin?
Almost a majority of the votes he's getting admit that they are voting against President Bush rather than for Pat Buchanan. Now, this negative vote, so to speak, is showing this time because someone is challenging the person who is in power in the United States. In the past, very rarely were presidents who were running for re-election challenged, and therefore society didn't know statistically exactly, unless people were asked, if you were to vote against the president, would you? Mm-hmm. But this time someone is running and people are expressing themselves, including voting negatively, so to speak.
Professor Calvert, you mentioned that you don't see Buchanan as taking the Republican nomination. Do you see a future with Buchanan on possibly Bush's team?
Well,
do they get along, or do they get along? Are they compatible?
Bush has lately made some peaceful gestures in Buchanan's camp. He knows that when he does get the nomination, and he will get the nomination, that he's going to need those people in his camp in the general election. He can't alienate them. He has to have them on his side. So he's going to be a peacemaker after he's shown that he can win. That's altogether predictable that he do that.
And this is one thing I wanted to say a while ago, which I did not, and that is if Pat Buchanan is to pull out at this point, as Bob indicated, there is pressure from the professionals in the party, from the central committee, or not central committee, but the national committee in the party to pressure Buchanan to withdraw. I think he might withdraw if some sort of a deal is stricken. I don't know if it will involve Pat Buchanan himself and the second Bush administration should he be re-elected, but I think this perhaps was one of his intentions behind running, is to, as I said a while ago, put the Bush administration back on the conservative track or whatever.
On the other hand, I think we would misunderstand Pat Buchanan if we think that he could be bought off, so to speak, by some kind of promise, either for a post in the Bush administration or for some sort of inevitably nebulous promise that the president would somehow shape up and be the kind of person that Buchanan thinks he ought to be. Buchanan is an ideologue. He is a person with a mission. He is a very, very, dogmatic is the word that's often applied to him. He's someone with a set of convictions as firmly held as anybody you're likely to find on the national scene today. He's a true believer. He's what Goldwater was perceived to be back in 1964. The very antithesis of a politician. A politician is somebody in our culture who makes deals. A politician is somebody who compromises. And compromising and deal-making in our culture is, to some people, synonymous with selling out, with having no principles, with being open to the highest bidder. Whatever else you can say about Pat Buchanan, he doesn't strike me, at any rate, as being that kind of guy.
A question that's been raised about Pat Buchanan in a negative light has been Israel. In his strong manner, his strong Buchanan manner, he's been harsh on Israel. He's made it known that he does not believe in a blank check being sent over to the Israeli government. He's often mentioned that the Israeli, that Congress is like an Israeli lobby, I think he stated. Professor Calvert, how do you view this situation?
Well, there are two issues involved here. First of all, there are a lot of people today, and Professor Nasr can speak to this more clearly than I. There are a lot of people today who are sharply critical of Israel. Israel has, to be sure, a lot of friends in American culture. They also have a lot of enemies. Pat Buchanan, of course, is among the latter. But what brings people to be critical, even very censorious of Pat Buchanan, is not that he is opposed to Israel, but rather that he is said to be anti-Semitic, which is a different issue. Mm-hmm. It's not, that you can be opposed to Israel without incurring the charge that you're anti-Semitic. And Bush and Buchanan is thought to be both. That's
now, are they by his critics? Is that just a neat slang term to toss on someone? Hey, you're anti-Semitic.
No. As I say, there are American politicians in good standing who have been critical of Israel, but they're not called anti-Semitic. Buchanan, because of his record in other and seemingly unrelated matters, has come to be thought as someone who is not